Hello, and welcome to another great interview for ICMI 2021. As always, I'm joined by Vernon Meigs. And today we have, and sorry, I have to read his name, Pat Kambhampati. Did I
Hello.
get that right?
You got it perfectly right.
Woo! For those who do not know Pat, he is a professor who is very big in the men's movement. He wants to talk to us today about his experiences with feminism growing up. What is your analysis of feminism, especially when you were growing up?
Well, my analysis in feminism began in around 1975 when my family immigrated from India to Minnesota. So in 1975, I became exposed to the TV at the time, and the TV at the time was talking about something called women's liberation. So as a curious-minded kid who ended up being curious, which is perhaps why I'm a scientist now, I asked a bunch of questions and I thought, why is women's liberation a thing, but men's liberation not a thing? Why should we liberate my mother from my father, but not my father from my mother? Why is it even reasonable to think about liberating anyone from another when in fact both people are doing legitimate amounts of hard work? So I was asking these questions when I was 6 years old or 7 years old. I was also asking questions of what does it mean to be racist or developing racism or ideas as I was experiencing that when I was 6 or 7 years old, as I was a kid, because I actually experienced racism by representing about a half dozen races over the course of my life. So when you can look like half of the people on earth, you sort of get much of the treatment of half of the people on earth. And I was comparing that to my treatment that I received from my teachers or the mothers that I knew when I would ask questions. And I would say there was a parallel there. And I found there was a lot of demeaning and dehumanizing ideas and words that was being put forth from even grown women to young boys on television or teachers. And I remember thinking this as a kid and think this is, to use a simpler term, bullshit.
So your bio says that you come from a family of freedom fighters in the Indian independence movement, and you yourself in general seem to be dedicated to the issue of liberty, and you refer to yourself as an egalitarian. Am I right so far?
Very much true.
Okay. Right. So does that passion for liberty influence you in what you do within the men's issues sphere?
I think that is 100% the case. I was actually just speaking to my mother right now about my grandfather, her father, and my dad's father, both of whom were involved in the Indian independence movement. My dad's father was one of the first people, amongst the first 100 or so. It was like that. And they suffered greatly. And as that was, it was nonviolent, but they suffered violence. I was asking, well, what do you think he was thinking at the time? Do you think he was worried about job preservation, or do you think he was worried about principles and freedom and liberty? And the reason I was saying this is because my mother and my wife and my family all asked me, don't you worry about job preservation? And I say, no, I care about freedom and liberty and principles. And that guides me through everything. That guided me through being a 6-year-old kid, dealing with what I consider both racism and genderism and xenophobia. It led me to think myself as an individual and want to view others as individuals. And I think that the feminist movement has created a collectivist viewpoint that is Marxist in nature and is fundamentally inhumane. It's unsexual, asexual, anti-sexual, inhumane, anti-male, anti-gay, because they assume that there's no gay or lesbian, rape or domestic abuse, because that can't happen under the patriarchy. So it's anti-human in so many ways.
That really resonates with me because, well, I'm of mixed ethnicity myself. I was actually born in Japan to a Caucasian Navy retiree and a Japanese mother. And I've experienced some degree of casual racism over there. And upon moving to the United States, I didn't really feel like I fit in here either. So this kind of led me to kind of develop that individualist, don't see me for where I came from or what my phenotype is. See me as the person I've become and what I've made myself to be. That answer really resonates with me. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. And my own kids now are mixed race. My wife is Caucasian, and I ask myself, what will my kids' experience be in how they're treated by the social justice warriors of the day because they look brown in the summer and white in the winter? So will their value as human beings oscillate along with the temperature and the amount of sun they receive? And the answer is yes, sadly, because people do judge a book by the cover nowadays, and that is in fact the case. Being male or whatever, they already have that going against them. So that's the big issue. And I would say being male is a bigger issue than any race, Black or brown or Hispanic or Asian or any other, or Native. I think being a male, you are looked down upon by society. You're having your humanity taken care of in a less important way than if you are female. And I hear this from people of all walks of life, male or female, parents or non-parents. I hear this from everyone with the exception of woke feminists. So that's what's amazing. According to set theory, there's like one, which is everything, and then there's the little subtraction from it, the little delta. So you have feminists being that little subset that doesn't agree with it, and then there's everything else, one minus delta, people of all walks of life, that 99% or 98% who are the silent majority who think, well, gee, I can't believe you're right. I think you're right. Men and boys are being dehumanized. But that's a very hard thing to recognize for a number of reasons that we could discuss.
I think it's interesting as well, while I can't relate to you on the race side of things, I can relate to you as being a boy asking questions about feminism. I often cite my red pill moment came when I was 8 years old in the 80s. I got in trouble for mimicking a behavior of a female, but she didn't get in trouble at all. And I couldn't articulate it then, but I understood that the world was very gynocentric. I'm curious, I mean, you briefly touched on this, but what kind of things did you experience in your youth against you being male? You mentioned your white female teachers. Certainly they were racist, but how were they sexist towards you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there's a number of ways I could answer that, and I'm sort of unsure how to progress. So I will say there was my own personal experiences, and then there is how my classmates and my peers were taught. One of the reasons why I'm a so-called men's rights advocate, I don't like using the term advocate or activist because I'm generally a person who stands back, and I like to be an intellectual, I like to be a scientist. I don't want to be an activist unless it's absolutely deathly necessary. And I think maybe for my grandparents fighting the Indian independence, it was deathly necessary, but they rather would have been scholars. And so now I feel like with men's issues, it's deathly necessary because things are seriously a problem. The problem that I experienced initially was described in the book by Janice Fiamengo called Sons of Feminism. And I think I was the opening chapter on that one. I think the reason I wanted to speak up against feminism and for men's rights was in large part my experiences as a kid. One experience that I had is that I was sexually assaulted when I was prepubescent. So I was, molested, you might say. And I was in school by 3 girls who were considerably older than me. And at the time, I don't even remember it. I actually never even remembered it until I was age 43, it was. And apparently that's not abnormal because apparently for men who've been abused as boys, which is not uncommon, you find it's like one day you wake up and you're either going to have a heart attack or realize that something bad happened when you were a kid and you just put it under your, in the back of your brain for so long and you kept unplugging away. So I was merely another one of those many, many, many men and boys. And what I felt at the time is the teachers at the time just didn't give a damn what was happening to me, whether I was being beaten or they didn't see when I was being molested, but I didn't think I was going to go around telling anyone. I didn't even think it happened to me. I sort of blotted it out, in my mind at the time. But I remember thinking, I live in a world where only they care about girls. It's girls, girls, girls. Whatever happens to them, that turned into sexual assault of girls, then turned into sexual assault of women. Then it turned into Take Back the Night in 1988 when I was a freshman in college. Then it turned into what you have as rape culture in the year 2014. Then it has to turn into Me Too. And I remember thinking, even when Me Too came up, I, for a split second, thought, well, what if I said Me Too? And I and and another man I know he was actually raped by a gay man when he was young. We both thought no, because it just seems kind of icky to use a simple term, to use Me Too. It seems to equate a priest molesting a child, which does happen, male or female, or a teacher molesting a child, which is the new version. But it's equating that with someone playing grab ass with you as a middle-aged secretary. Sure, you don't want to play grab ass with as a middle-aged secretary, but that's not the same as a 10-year-old kid getting sexually assaulted. What Me Too did is to equate all of those things first, and second, it made it gendered because the only people who talked about it were women. There were no men in the Me Too movement. There have been for like nearly a split second. And then the whole thing turned into another, let's have women discuss men and have women basically attack male sexuality, heterosexuality, and male fundamental behavior, and generalize all male behavior by the behavior of a small number. And the whole thing happened between 1988 with Take Back the Night to the Me Too movement, whenever that was, 2016 or so. That represented the culmination of it, I think. So when Me Too started on Facebook and Twitter, for a split second, I thought, yeah. And then about a nanosecond later, I thought, absolutely no way in hell. This is the worst thing ever. I know it's going to explode horribly. And I knew it was going to end terribly. And I knew it was a horrible idea. And sure enough, that's where we are now in 2021. The whole Me Too movement's falling apart. The people are, looking like absolutely inane, the original people, like whether it's Rose McGowan or the other woman, I forgot her name is, the Italian woman, but nonetheless, all these people, they look silly now, and the movement looks silly now, and you knew that was going to happen. But what bothers me is this: no one remembers what was said. And I want it to be remembered what was said to men. If you were Black and you lived in America, you would want it to be remembered how you were treated. While myself, not having been African American, I still remember how I was treated, and I would like that to be remembered. Mine was a unique experience. It wasn't like a national experience, but it was unique, whatever. And I don't want it to be swept under the rug. But for men, the way we've been treated has been swept under the rug. It should be remembered that famous academics said all men are potential rapists. That should be remembered. That professor is still a professor at Stanford. And right now, I'm actually part of a discussion series at Stanford, at the business school, about classical liberalism and bringing it back. But we are doing this at the time where there's a Stanford Law School professor who originally said in the 80s, all men are potential rapists. All heterosexual sex is rape. Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin were very popular when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s. And no one wants to remember them anymore, but I never forgot. I'd like people to remember Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin, and I would like them to be remembered as the way we remember racists or anti-Semites.
I just want to make a quick comment to you before I let Vernon ask a question, but you're probably thinking of Alyssa Milano. She was big with the Me Too movement.
That's right.
There was an early representation of men in the Me Too movement, but as soon as men started to use the hashtag Me Too, feminism came in and said that you're not allowed to be a part of our movement. This is just for women. The other thing I wanted to comment on was saying that it wasn't until your 40s when you remembered this, and you're absolutely correct on that. The average amount of time between an incident of rape that a male experienced as a boy before reporting it into adulthood is 20 years.
Right. Yeah, I remember finding that on the internet. And so what happened is, in my case, I had one of those sort of grand moments. You might have said a heart attack. I didn't have a heart attack. I had another form of a health problem where I, saw the white light, nearly died, and so forth like that with diabetes. And so in the time when I came back, it took about a half a year to come back or whatever, but nonetheless, I started to ask about the meaning of my own life. And the reason I say this is because I'm already pretty successful as a man, and as a man, that's what you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be a work production unit. And I think it's the guy Warren Farrell, the guy who really started the ball rolling for everyone. He wrote, that man is a success production unit, and female is a reproduction production unit. And that used to be the old way of thinking about things, but we only have changed the way we view women. We don't change the way we view men. So what happens is females, because they're reproduction units, have intrinsic life value. You don't have to be successful to have life value as a woman. All women have life value. And if you're reproductively fit and really attractive, then you're really, really attractive. And, it's like that. But men, you have to really accomplish something to be valuable. And I think it was even Chris Rock who said, a woman is loved, a dog is loved, but a man has to do work or to be loved or something to that effect. And I found that whether it was true or not, that's how I felt. And I realized that I already was successful as a work production unit. I had exceeded my father's work production output. My father died of male privilege of a heart attack on Christmas Day when I was 22 because of male privilege of working to death. He worked until he paid off college tuition for his 2 kids and then died on one day. Boom, done. Male privilege. So I thought, and I nearly had the same experience. Am I going to die of male privilege just like my dad did at middle age or whatever it was? And so I started to ask, what does my life matter? And then I started to go back to what about my childhood life? Didn't my childhood life matter? And it seemed to say that the women of the world seemed to say no, the white women of the world seemed to say no. But I was asking that question again, and that raised the question of I'd like my life to matter. And I would also like, even though now it's sort of, I'm already middle-aged and sort of past all that, I would like for my son's life to matter in ways that mine didn't or men's didn't, because we should have intrinsic life value too. If women have that, we should be more than work production units. And the onus is on women to say you are more than a work production unit. You do have intrinsic life value, but that's not privilege that women have. Women only talk about the privilege that men have, and the difficulties that women have. They never talk about the privileges that women have and the challenges that men have. So in the ancient societies, the woman was privileged for having a uterus. We could call that uterus privilege. And then she got to live, and she got to live in the house. The man was probably working like a slave in the fields and then died at age 30, and the woman died at age 40 from working herself to death. But nonetheless, life was very difficult, and they made the best of it to make the family unit survive. The people tried to make the family unit survive. And so who was privileged? Well, actually no one. It was a symbiosis, a symbiotic relationship. And the feminists basically forgot about all the effort of men to provide for the wife and the family, because that's actually the purpose of man and woman, and our instinct. That's our instinct to do this. Whether we want to or not, or end up doing it or not, that's not the point. That's what designs us from our DNA onwards. It's our blueprints. It's hardwired in our DNA to behave in such a way. And we see it from little kids on. If you ever go to daycare and you have kids, little boys and little girls behave in a very different way. If you believe gender is a social construct, you are willfully ignorant.
So you're a professor of chemical physics at McGill University, correct?
That's correct.
As you've mentioned, you've been warned that they would ask, don't you care about keeping your job? Talking about men's issues and these extra controversial sort of things. But here you are geeking out to the capacity that you've been doing. So how have you been received by those who know you personally and professionally? How has it impacted your career, if at all?
I think it has impacted my career negatively, but I've never been one to try to strive to advance my career in the most linear and predictable manner. I've always been one to pursue what I think is interesting and meaningful and let the chips fall where they may. So I believe that it has harmed my general perception. As a case in point, I was recently emailing with some of my colleagues student evaluation that I received in 2019 for teaching thermodynamics to biologically oriented students. So it's physical chemistry for non-majors, people who don't want to be there. It's pretty dry stuff and no one wants to be there. What I got was one of the stranger reviews I've ever seen, and it was very troubling to me personally. It was someone saying, Professor Kambhampati has an online persona on Instagram, and I find it troubling because on it, he makes fun of leftists. And he also says that we don't live in a patriarchy, and he made fun of male privilege because he made mention of things like men's suicide rates and homelessness rates and homicide rates and things like that. This makes me afraid to be taught by him. Now, I'm not against free speech, but I think I should have a right to be taught by people that don't scare me. I actually, this is not verbatim the case, but it was about almost exactly, because I looked at it this morning and I emailed it to my colleagues. And I'm put a compare and contrast. This is on Facebook and on Instagram. Both my Facebook and my Instagram are both private now because I've been reported to my chair twice, to my dean twice. So I don't want to be reported anymore. If I give a presentation, this is me giving a presentation. I can do it over the course of some time, but I'm not going to put a meme on the internet that an undergrad's going to see and then say, Pat hates all women. And then he should be fired or not being allowed to teach anymore, which is precisely what happened. So what that created for me was a moment where this is presumably a wealthy white girl. No one else would say such a thing. A poor black boy would never say such a thing. This was a wealthy white girl from private school. And I went to, how do I know this? I went to private school with wealthy white girls, both in high school and college. I know them well. They are my peers. They are everyone I know. And this, you have to have the privilege to complain. And 100 years ago, wealthy white women complained against black men and black men got lynched. Well, in this case, a wealthy white woman complained against a brown man and a brown man could get canceled. That was the fear of mine. And it was going back to that ancient stuff where all you have to do is be a wealthy white woman and you accuse a man, even worse yet, a colored man of something, then your life matters less. So what I realized is I'm an accomplished professor, I'm an accomplished teacher, I'm an accomplished scientist, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I was a Cub Scout leader, I'm all these things, and none of that matters except what this little white girl thinks. And I don't know it was a little white girl, but I'm saying it isn't a little black boy. Probably is not a little Chinese boy. So then that was one quote that I had. Next to it were four other quotes I had that were strangely good. I mean, my mother couldn't have written better ones, and I was really pleased by them, but one of which was that he is a great man. And I thought to myself, who would say he's a great man? A white person wouldn't say it, and a woman wouldn't say it, and a white woman would never say it. It sounds like the words of an immigrant. Because only an immigrant wouldn't not hate men enough to say he is a great man, and they understand there's this thing called a great man. And this person, male or female, probably an immigrant, probably working hard to get ahead and getting into nursing school or pharmacy school or really getting the most of the university, thought of me as someone trying to help them understand things and understand the universe. And not just that, I think because I was also talking about Greta Thunberg at the time and how they, instead of following her, they should follow science and try to make the best contributions and do the things they can to make the world a better place. And that happened because either they could walk out of class and follow Greta Thunberg, or they can stay in class and study science. So I said, your choice, though, why don't you come stay in class and study science? And they all did. And I think some people even gave me like an ovation or something like that. So that's why I think at the time I had a number of very positive comments where they said, you know, he is a great man. And that really moved me. I mean, again, only an immigrant would say such a thing, is the way I feel as an immigrant myself, as a twice immigrant myself. But that was such a contrast to what that other comment was, which was he shouldn't be allowed to teach because he mentioned that he doesn't believe the patriarchy exists and men's suicide rates.
So I want to talk a little bit about your academic career as a professor. You started in 2003, so I was kind of like the middle point, or maybe you can tell me you had a different experience, but in society, we had the 90s of the political correctness, and then it died down until the 2010s when we got the social justice warrior movement. So you kind of started between those two peaks. What was the interaction from instructor to student on all the politics compared to today? Has it actually changed for you? Have you seen that change, or was it always there?
I think your timing is absolutely right. And I was speaking with someone named John Ellis, who's a professor of German literature, retired, and he's now writing on this topic. And he gave a lecture at Stanford that I was listening to. And we were in, you know, he was a full professor at the time when this was in the 80s and really starting. So when I asked him, when did you believe the lunacy really began? And he seemed to say it began in the late 80s. And I thought, thank you, you hit the nail on the head, because I was an undergraduate then. He was a professor then, I was an undergraduate then. And when I was an undergraduate in 1988 starting, that's when the students began to like grievance studies. Instead of going into political science and economics, they went into women's studies, and women's studies is the original grievance studies. Since this is a specific topic to men and not just all of academia and wokeness, I could go on for hours on that too. I think the question is, To whom can we assign agency and accountability? And I'm going to say feminists. I'm going to say feminists created the Marxist culture in the university starting in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Those people are now retirement age. They're like Catherine Kinnan at Stanford. They're famous people, and now they're university heads. Those people then had daughters, and their daughters are my age. Daughters my age have kids who are 16, and those kids who are 16 are the ones who are thinking I'm trans, or they're thinking that the patriarchy's out to get me, or they act like people in Hollywood do, and it's absurd. But these are all generations upon things, and eventually I think what happens is things neutralize because it's a highly gendered process is what I observe. And the fact that it's highly gendered is actually not surprising from evolutionary psychology, because this is how women exert power, by talking to create social networks. And what's the best social network of all? Facebook and Twitter. So women create these social networks to execute their own power in an indirect and soft manner. As Jordan Peterson will more eloquently tell us, he'll say men will just come face to face. And that's true whether you're fighting for a piece of food or whether you're a scientist fighting to say it's my idea, not yours. You as a man will fight, but you don't fight with other women. Let's say as a scientist or an academic, you don't fight, but you do fight with other male scientists. You still fight like as if it's a war. Maybe if you're guitarists or musicians, you fight like it's a war. If you're hackers, you fight like it's a war. But men fight. That's how we interact. And then we forget about our fight and have a beer. But women interact differently. And so I think the social network is a largely gendered quality to it, where there are witch hunts to marginalize and ostracize and cancel people. And it's a gendered thing, I believe.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned male musicians, fight amongst themselves. But I've I've been involved in Florida's music scene a few years back. Based on my experience, nowadays more women are being involved in, say, like the metal scene and stuff like that. And that in itself, I don't have a problem with. But you talking about how women are more about socially connecting as opposed to men kind of duking it out kind of reminds me. A lot of the narrative in that scene nowadays is always support other musicians no matter what. That's the outward approach. Now, behind the scenes, they're always kind of judging each other, right? So, but it doesn't seem like this kind of, we can talk face to face. It's more sneaky and conniving when negativity does happen. So I just wanted to comment that that's kind of what it reminded me of.
Right. And that's the sort of thing you might expect. And, it's as funny you mentioned, as I'm a longtime rock and roll fan. And I think the other thing that I love in my life, I've loved it longer than science, is probably rock and roll. So, that's been my greatest love of all. And I am saddened to see how much of it has evolved. Some of it I'm a jazz fan as well. I've sort of grown into that because I find that an interesting thing. But obviously jazz is a dead form. I wonder about that for rock and roll, and I feel sad about it. But I also feel gratified that I lived in the 90s. I was young in the 90s, so I saw some of the greatest musical acts I could have seen in a generation. But what saddens me is not that it's aging, and it does age, and that's okay. What saddens me is the intrusion of feminists and social justice warriors into rock and roll. Rock and roll was about freedom and rebellion. Blues was about freedom and rebellion, and the fact that you're a oppressed motherfucker for real, And rap was too. Originally, gangster rap was. And I grew up liking gangster rap in the early 90s. And according to my kids, there's no gangster rap anymore. They don't do that. They listen to Drake or God knows what. And that's fine, because they're not making, there's no gangsters like that anymore. It's not like Public Enemy and NWA and whatever it is that I might have grown up with, nor is the rock and roll like Allman Brothers or the Faces, where it was free music, or metal, like anything from Judas Priest to the old metal like Iron Maiden, or things were free back then, and it was transgressive, and it was loud, and it was in your face, and that's rock and roll. I'm going to tell you, I've been booted from many I'm just a civilian on Facebook. That's what I started as Chris saw me. I was merely a civilian on Facebook. Being a civilian on Facebook, I've been banned from many pages. I've been banned from essentially almost every feminist page you possibly could be on Facebook, because I've asked enough questions that they banned me. But there's a punk band called War Against Women. And I thought, this is fucking hilarious. I know there's a band called War on Drugs, and that's kind of funny, but there's also a band called War Against Women, and they're a punk band. So I, trolled them in a sense, and I wanted to have fun with them, and they banned me from their webpage. And I'm I'm at that point 45 to 50-year-old. Not that was maybe 5 years ago. I was 45-year-old, father of two who was a punk in 1985. But that was when it was real punk. That was also 1985, and it was you actually got your ass kicked for being a punk. Now it's very different. So I got booted from the Facebook page of War Against Women, which showed the stage of rock and roll and feminism's intrusion into rock and roll. Feminism's had an intrusion into so much of our culture. And sometimes I guess I'm struck by, it's almost so obvious how much feminism has its tentacles everywhere, and that's affecting so much, and I think damaging so much. So it's easier now to almost talk about all the multitude of other things that feminism has so infected. But I think it's the root cause of so much. So academia is melting. Who started it? Oh, the feminists in the 70s, and so on. Everything propagated from there.
You're definitely right about it propagating in other things. I'm an author, an independent author, and that's pretty much feminism right there. You want to make it as an independent author, you've got to kowtow to feminism. That's probably why I'm unsuccessful, because I don't, and I'm public about that. But other things as well, I'm sure Vernon can attest to Magic the Gathering. That has definitely become a lot more feminism over the years. A lot of clubs and organizations have kowtowed to feminism. So certainly you have painted this picture that feminism is basically a virus that has infested all aspects of life. So let me ask you this then. Are you hopeful for the future that we could live in a society that doesn't have feminism?
Yeah, I'm actually very hopeful about this change for feminism. And I actually drew a timeline of all this because I thought that something big was happening in 2013. In 2013, I saw Janice Fiamengo gave her speech at the University of Toronto on something like what's the problem with feminism or something, or women's studies or something to this effect. And that's when a riot nearly ensued. But when Janice gave that talk, I thought it was brilliant. And of course, Janice is, my friend, and that's why she's headlining, not that's why, but she's headlining this conference here. And Janice was so brilliant and lucid in how she was speaking, and the fact that she offended the students so deeply. I thought this was a historic moment. I thought I was watching history taking place like it rarely happened in the United States, like it did happen in Russia, like it did happen in Germany, like it did happen in Italy and Spain, but not, some places more than others where there were revolutions. And I think this was taking place now where there was a huge disconnect between what Janice was saying and what the kids were saying. So then in 2014, the next year, I saw on Facebook a page called Women Against Feminism. And that, I believe, really opened the floodgates. If the page was short-lived but impactful, it showed women who were typically youngish, not always, some of them were mothers, some of them are mothers of sons, but most of them were young women saying, I'm smart, I'm not stupid, I'm not a bimbo, I'm not ditzy, and I'm not a feminist. I believe men should have equal rights. I don't believe they're being treated equally. I believe they're being dehumanized. And it was largely by girls, young women who seemed, bright and motivated for equality. And that gave me hope. And I thought, boy, this is amazing. A lot of people came to that website to make fun of them. And so everyone said, this is the most horrible thing. It was publicized in The Guardian as being a horrible thing and a stupid thing, and a bunch of stupid little privileged girls or God knows what. So I and other people sort of came out of the closet there as saying, we want to question feminism too. And this is the first place we could see in which you could do so. So in 2014, we were doing so. And all of a sudden, we found out there were many of us, and most of us were doing so. It wasn't like we were stereotypical sexist misogynists that were women haters. Instead, we were largely egalitarians that felt ill-treated as men, or were women who felt that men were ill-treated. And some people were traditionalists, some people were egalitarian. None of us were feminists. We were all just saying, how about the treatment of men and boys? And gay are straight too. So it was also a big point of gay men saying we exist too. It's not just violence against women. Then 2015 it grew, and then by 2016 they shut it down. So I think by 2016 they had a lot of anti-feminist men's rights advocate type websites or Facebook pages And I think by 16 or 17, Facebook shut them down under some various draconian laws they began developing. And that's when I knew that also this was big. The cat was out of the bag, and Facebook and Google wanted to shut it down. But you can find things online. And when I started to look on Facebook, what I would see is if you go to the discussion page on even The Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post, people will finally be actually questioning the feminist narrative, because the ideas from the men's rights movement in 2014 to 2016 let the cat out of the bag. And by 2016 to 2020, it's out there. And I don't go to those pages anymore because I think movements are short-lived, and they should be short-lived. I think the cat was let out of the bag, and now we have to do the hard work of whatever's going on and what other people are doing. I, for example, am trying to do hard work from within McGill University by trying to say, hey, look, the university is 2/3 female and 1/3 male. All sexual assault services, all help services, and all advancement services for careers go to females, none go to males. What about my sons? Don't my sons matter too? And that applies to all of our sons. So as a professor, I get to ask those questions. I get to affect positive change from within. And I see that there's others who want to do so in the year 2021. I think there's a lot of people who are saying there is a problem, and it's not just the social justice warriors generically, but it's also feminists. And I had just received an email from someone at Stanford who had said his sexual assault policy seminar was taking place. It was all based upon DEI ideas and beliefs. And they talked about feminism and the patriarchy, and sexual assault proves the patriarchy. And I already have a canned set of lecture notes that I gave him, that I made, that I gave to my own university about how sexual assault is gender neutral, and also, hetero homo, same thing too. But you only focus on one group.
Based on your experiences and in your career and in academia, do you have any advice for men trying to start or hold a career, especially in academia, but could be STEM, while openly taking this red pill position, if I may, that we have?
I think that's a very hard thing. A lot of people have suggested that I'm in it for career suicide. And I say I'm not. I'm not in it for a career suicide. I plan on having a long, illustrious career. And when I retire, I plan on writing more about this, but that'll be 20 years from now. So in the meantime, I have unusual street credibility based upon my so-called lived experience that enables me to speak when others cannot. If I were a straight white man who never experienced anything, but I were a normal, happy scientist, I would be terrified to speak my mind. So I'm speaking my mind for them. My peers are normal. Most of them are, normal, regular guy scientists. Most of them are male. If you work in a very physical area, they tend to be mostly male. They tend to be mostly Asians and Jews. That's who people are in physical science mostly. That's half of physical science. And if I don't stand up for them, I would feel like I'm lacking in some sort of spine or backbone, or this is serious stuff here where people are being dehumanized.
So we're coming to a close now, and want to ask you one last question. You mentioned earlier that you're a part of a group that wants to bring back classical liberalism. And I was wondering if you could just kind of give us a brief explanation of what classical liberalism means to you.
Classical liberalism to me could also pass for classical conservatism, and I often consider one, to make a sort of a math analogy, one is the conjugate of the other. One is, there's a yin-yang analogy in math called the Fourier transform, and this is a classical version of this, I think, where conservatives and liberals are complementary. I actually grew up a flaming leftist as a kid until age 30. And then I began to work in industry, which opened my mind. I think I mentioned that earlier. And I went from there. That was my Thomas Sowell type of moment of working in industry, seeing regular people and realizing it wasn't just a bunch of academias in Ivory Tower that were everything. Then I went back to the Ivory Tower, and then I was a liberal. And then 10 years in academia turned me from being a liberal into a libertarian. And I probably remain a libertarian just to be unaffiliated. I don't want to be affiliated with any group, but I believe they all have reasonable ideas. Liberals and conservatives have reasonable ideas. I just think the leftists right now don't have reasonable ideas, and we have to protect a lot of things against attack from the leftists, who are like the modern version of communists. I'm not sure if that answered your question. I think I maybe went on a digression here.
what are some ways that someone might be able to reach out to you?
No, I'm available on the internet once you find me. You can Google me and I'm everywhere on the internet in all sorts of ways. And I have been since the early days on the internet. I mean, when my dean says, people find you on the internet and they find things you've written, I say, I've been on the internet since 1995. I'm never not on the internet. And the internet's got my fingerprints everywhere on it. So, you can't erase me on the internet and include what I've written. You can Google me and find me at McGill. And from there, I can answer any email. So I'm always welcome to people contacting me at McGill. And my interest is to effect positive change for men and boys because they have been dehumanized by feminists. The very idea of feminism is to dehumanize men and boys. It is there in the name. My nephew, who is now a 25-year-old PhD graduate student, laughed and said it's in the name. My 15-year-old son laughed and said it's the name. Don't they have a right to be heard? And I say this to all the aging feminists out there, or the mothers of sons or the mothers of daughters. Don't you think that my sons have an equal right to be heard as your daughters? And you better not say no. You absolutely better not say no. This is a line that you will not cross here. It's time for my sons to speak and you will listen. And that's something that I'm absolutely 100% immovable about.
Okay, well, I thank you for coming out today. This has been a great interview. And I say this to so many of the people I've interviewed, I could listen to you for hours. And I mean it every single time I say it. I just love talking to people and getting different perspectives.
Yeah, it's good to talk.
I greatly appreciate you joining us for ICMI 21. And I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. It was my pleasure to be on this, Chris. And I think it's a very important thing that you guys are doing now. And I think that the initial revolution of 2014, or the great meme war of 2015, you might call it, that's what I like to tell my kids. I was in the great meme war of 2015, and that can't go on forever. Now we have to do the heavy lifting and the hard work, and I think you guys are doing that, and that's great.
All right. Well, take care, everyone.
Take care.